She was 45 years old when the last of her family turned her out into the road with $9 sewn into the hem of her traveling dress and nothing else to her name. Wendell Sutter, her late husband's older brother, stood on the porch of the farmhouse she had scrubbed and mended and loved for 11 years, and told her, without much unkindness in his voice, that the land had never truly been hers to keep, that the law favored a brother over a widow, and that she would do well to find somewhere else to be a burden. So she went. She rode the rails as far west as $9 would carry a woman traveling alone, which was not very far at all, and she stepped off into a half-abandoned mining town called Larkin's Notch, Colorado, where the only property for sale that week was a collapsing, boarded-up saloon that every soul in town swore was cursed. She paid $7 for it. To everyone watching, it seemed the last foolish act of a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. None of them yet knew what was waiting beneath its floor, a secret that would not only remake her life, but call an entire town back from ruin. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Naomi Sutter. If you have ever been told that something broken or forgotten has no worth left in it, tell us where you're watching from tonight. We would love to know. Naomi had not always been a woman with $9 and no roof. She had been raised in Zanesville, Ohio, in a narrow clapboard house that smelled always of cedar shavings and linseed oil, the daughter of a cooper and joiner named Ambrose Whitfield, a quiet, exacting man who made his living building barrels tight enough to hold whiskey without weeping a single drop, and who taught his only daughter, in the absence of any son to teach, everything he knew about wood. She learned to read grain the way other girls learned to read scripture, to know by the color and the run of it whether a plank had been cut from the heart of the tree or the sap-soft edge, to know that a board could look ruined on the outside, gray and split and forgotten, and still be sound as iron underneath if you knew where to look and how to knock it. Her father used to say that most people judged a thing by what had been done to it, rather than by what it was still capable of holding, and Naomi carried that sentence with her the way other women carried a locket. Her mother, Margaret, had come from farther east, a Doyle by birth, from a family that had scattered in the years before Naomi was born, and Margaret spoke of her people only rarely, and always with a kind of careful sorrow, as though touching an old bruise to see if it had healed. There had been an older brother, Margaret admitted once, a boy named Elias who had gone west chasing gold when Margaret herself was barely more than a child, and who had, in her mother's clipped and unwilling words, done a terrible wrong by the town that took him in, and never came home to answer for it. Naomi asked no further questions. It was clear the subject cost her mother something to speak of, and in the Whitfield house, you did not spend what wasn't yours to spend. Naomi grew into a young woman who could plane a door true, keep a ledger without a smudge or an error, and preserve enough vegetables and meat in a single autumn to see a household through the leanest winter. And when she was 22, she married Thomas Sutter, a steady, sun-browned young farmer from the next county over, a man who did not say much but who looked at her the way her father looked at a well-fitted joint, as though something had finally come together the way it was always meant to. He had watched her, courting her slowly across 2 harvests, mend a hinge on his mother's gate that 3 other men had already given up on and declared beyond saving. And he told her once, in the plain way he said most things, that he had decided that very afternoon he would rather have a wife who could fix a thing than one who could only admire it from a distance. They built a life on the Sutter land outside of Coshocton, a low white farmhouse with a good well, and a barn Thomas had raised with his own hands, its rafters still smelling of fresh-cut oak the first year they were married. Naomi papered the kitchen herself, kept hens that laid clear through the winter when the neighbors did not, and learned every settle and creak of that house so well that she could tell, in the dark, which board in the front hallway would groan under a boot and which would hold its silence. If that life was not without its griefs, 2 children lost before they had drawn a full year of breath, a sorrow Naomi carried privately and never let harden her, tending their small stones in the churchyard every spring with the same careful attention she gave her cellar shelves. It was, for 11 years, a life she was proud of. She was known in that country as a woman whose hands could fix nearly anything, whose cellar shelves were always full by the first hard frost, and whose steadiness, more than once, had held a household together through a season that might otherwise have broken it. The year the well ran low, the year fever took half the county's livestock and somehow spared theirs. The year Thomas broke his leg during planting, and Naomi walked the plow herself, rather than lose the crop to a bad season and worse luck. She believed, the way her father had taught her to believe, that worth was a quiet and durable thing, and that it did not announce itself loudly, and that the people and the objects the world too quickly wrote off were very often the ones holding the most inside them. It was a fine thing to believe, in a farmhouse kitchen with a good fire going and a husband's boots drying by the door. She would need it a good deal more before this story was done, out in a colder and harder place. Thomas died in the spring of 1888, of a fever that came on fast after 3 days working a wet harvest, and was gone within the week, leaving no written will behind him, only a wife who had loved him plainly for 11 years and a farm that, under the custom of that place and time, was not hers to simply keep. Wendell Sutter had watched his younger brother's land prosper for a decade with an envy he had never fully hidden, and he did not wait long to press his claim. He brought forward old debts he said Thomas had owed him, papers signed in a hand that Naomi did not entirely trust, and a local magistrate who owed Wendell more favors than he owed the truth. And within 2 months of burying her husband, Naomi Sutter found herself standing in the yard she had swept every morning for 11 years, watching her furniture carried out onto a wagon that was not headed anywhere she was invited to follow. Wendell was not cruel about it, not in any way she could have taken before a court, even if courts had been inclined to hear a widow's word over a brother's. He simply told her the land was his now, by right and by law, and that he wished her well, and that he could spare her $9 for her trouble and her train fare, and that he expected she would understand. She did not understand. She stood in the dooryard she had swept 1,000 mornings and watched 2 men she had never seen before load her hen's coop and her good rocking chair onto a borrowed wagon, and she found she could not even summon the anger she felt she owed the moment. Only a kind of stunned, hollow arithmetic, counting what she was permitted to keep against what had simply, quietly, ceased to be hers. She took the $9 because there was nothing else to take, and she packed what fit into a single trunk: her father's old chisel, worn smooth in the handle from 40 years of use before it ever reached her hand; her mother's Bible, with the Whitfield and Doyle family names penciled faintly inside the cover; 2 dresses, her wedding lines, a small tin of garden seed she could not bring herself to leave behind for Wendell's wife to plant. She did not look back at the house as the wagon carried her toward the depot. She had learned, from long practice at her father's bench, that some breaks were cleaner if you did not stop to examine the grain. She boarded a westbound train with no fixed idea of where she meant to stop, only a fierce and frightened certainty that she could not stay anywhere near Coshocton and watch another woman keep her kitchen and sleep in her bed. The journey blurred by in a way she would later struggle to recall clearly. Dim depot platforms, the smell of coal smoke and other people's supper, long stretches of prairie going gold and then gray as the country climbed westward and the air thinned and cooled. She counted her dwindling coin at every stop, watching towns rise and fall past the window, each one a little rougher and a little more temporary looking than the last, until the conductor called a name she had never heard before, Larkin's Notch, and told her, not unkindly, that her fare would not stretch to the next stop after this one. She stepped down onto a platform of rough-cut planks with her trunk, her $9 now down to a little less, and no earthly notion of what came next. She rode as far as her money allowed, which turned out to be a rough, thinning mining town in the Colorado high country called Larkin's Notch, a place that had boomed bright in the gold and silver years and was now sliding, slowly and visibly, back into the mountain that had made it, half its storefronts boarded, its population thinned to the stubborn and the trapped, its single bank the only building on the main street that still looked freshly painted. Naomi arrived on a Thursday with almost nothing left in her purse, and she might have kept moving, had she not seen, tacked to the door of the small stone courthouse, a notice of a town auction, delinquent tax properties, sold that Saturday to the highest bidder, no minimums refused. She went, mostly because it cost nothing to look, and because a woman with no home and no plan will often go wherever there is a crowd, for the simple comfort of not being alone in a strange place. And there, at the bottom of the list, offered almost as an afterthought, sat a derelict saloon on the edge of town, its sign hanging by one nail, its windows boarded gray, its roofline sagging like the back of an old horse. A building the auctioneer described, with a small and unkind laugh, as the blind mule folks, cursed as they come, buy it if you're feeling brave or foolish. A ripple of laughter went through the gathered crowd. Someone muttered that old Doyle's ghost still walked the place. Naomi, who did not believe much in ghosts and believed a great deal in good bones, found herself studying the building's door frame from across the street, and noticing, the way her father had trained her eye to notice, that whoever had built that frame had cut and fitted it with real and careful skill, cursed or not. The bidding, when it came, was brief and unenthusiastic, because no one in Larkin's Notch wanted the blind mule saloon, tax delinquent and rumor-soaked as it was, and Naomi Sutter, with 7 of her 9 remaining dollars, bought it. She heard the laughter behind her as she signed the paper, a widow with a single trunk buying the town's most disreputable ruin. And she felt, for one long moment, exactly as foolish as they clearly believed her to be. A cold-eyed man near the courthouse steps watched the whole exchange without laughing at all. He was introduced to her afterward, briefly and formally, as Cornelius Vance, president of the Larkin's Notch Trust and Savings Bank, and the most prosperous man for 50 miles in any direction. And something crossed his face when he heard which property she had purchased, something quick and carefully smoothed over, gone almost before Naomi registered it, before he told her, with a thin and unbothered smile, that she'd wasted her money, and that the bank would have been glad to take that eyesore off the town's hands for scrap value alone, had anyone thought to ask him first. She spent her first night in Larkin's Notch sweeping 2 decades of dust out of the saloon's single long room by lamplight, too tired and too proud to mind the cobwebs or the smell of old mildew. And it was in that sweeping that her father's training rose up in her again, unbidden. The long bar along the north wall, though warped and gray with neglect, had been built by a craftsman, dovetailed, not nailed, the joints so tight a knife blade would not slide between them. Whoever old Doyle had been, he had known wood the way her own father had. And it was that same eye, moving idly across the floor as she worked, that caught on a run of boards near the back corner, behind where the bar's old till had stood, planks whose grain ran crosswise to their neighbors, whose seams were cut cleaner than any floor built for boots and spilled whiskey had any right to be. She told herself it was nothing. She knelt anyway, worked her father's old chisel into the seam, the way she had done 100 times prying rotten boards from a barn floor, and the plank lifted with a smoothness that no forgotten, rotting floor should have had. Beneath it was not rot at all, but a shallow, dry cavity lined with tin, holding a small strongbox that had clearly been placed there and hidden there on purpose. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside lay a scattering of tarnished silver coins, older in mint than anything currently circulating, a leather-bound ledger swollen soft with age, and a single sealed letter, the ink brown but legible, addressed in a careful, deliberate hand. To whoever finds this after me, and to my sister's children, should God in his mercy ever bring them home. Naomi sat on the dusty floor of a saloon she had bought for $7, in a town where she knew not one living soul, and read by lamplight until the candle guttered low. The ledger was a record, meticulous, dated, unmistakable, of something called the Larkin's Notch Miners Cooperative Association, founded in 1861. Its pages filled with the names of dozens of small claim holders and their families, each entry noting deposits of silver dust and coin set aside collectively. A fund meant to buy the town its own ore mill and to carry struggling claims through the lean seasons, so that no single hard winter could ruin a family that had come west with nothing but hope and a shovel. The treasurer of that cooperative, the ledger made plain, had been a man named Elias Doyle. The letter told the rest, in a voice grown urgent and then, toward its end, tired in a way that pressed at Naomi's chest like a hand. In the winter of 1866, Doyle wrote, a young and ambitious bank clerk named Cornelius Vance, working alongside the town's marshal, had come to the cooperative's members claiming the fund was insolvent, its assets already spent, and had produced papers, forged, Doyle swore, forged in a hand he knew was not his own, dissolving the cooperative and folding what remained of its holdings into a new private bank that Vance himself would soon come to own outright. Doyle had refused to hand over the true ledger or the true fund. He had hidden both, coin and record together, beneath the floor of his own saloon, intending to carry the truth to a circuit judge the following spring. Instead, he had been accused of embezzlement himself, his name dragged through every parlor and saloon in town, his standing destroyed before he ever reached a courtroom that would hear him. He had died 4 years later alone of a wasting consumption, in a room above the very saloon where his money still lay hidden beneath his boots, still insisting, to the handful of people who would still speak to him, that he had stolen nothing, and buried in the town's poorest corner under a stone that bore only his name and no dates at all, as if the town itself could not be bothered to finish the accounting. Naomi read the letter twice through before she understood, with a shock that seemed to travel up through the floorboards themselves, why the hand that had written it felt so strangely familiar. She dug her mother's Bible from her trunk with fingers that would not quite hold steady, and found, penciled faintly on the inside cover in her mother's own careful script, the family record Margaret Whitfield had kept. Elias Doyle, B. 1834, gone west 1859, her mother's brother, her own great-uncle, dead and disgraced and forgotten in a pauper's grave not 400 yards from where she now knelt, had spent his final years trying to protect the town's money from the very man who had since become that town's most powerful citizen. A man Naomi had shaken hands with not 12 hours earlier, a man who had smiled thinly at her and called her foolish for buying his old enemy's saloon. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead with the ledger open across her knees, tracing names by lamplight, Whitcomb, Rays, Kessler, Odom, dozens of them, each with a column of small, careful figures beside it, deposits of a few dollars in silver dust here, $10 there, the accumulated hope of families who had come west with a shovel and a prayer, and had trusted a neighbor to keep their savings safer than their own tent could. She understood slowly, turning each brittle page, the size of what she was holding, not merely her own family's stolen honor, though that alone would have been enough to make her hands tremble, but the buried, provable truth of a theft that had shaped the fortunes of an entire town for over 20 years. Somewhere out in the dark streets of Larkin's Notch, descendants of the men and women listed in that ledger were still living. Some of them, she would soon learn, still struggling, in a town whose only bank charged interest rates that seemed designed to keep a small claim holder small forever, generation after generation, without ever quite starving him outright. She thought of her father's old lesson, delivered over a lifetime of barrel staves and cellar doors, that worth did not announce itself loudly, and that the world was too quick to write off what it had not troubled itself to examine closely. She had bought a cursed, worthless building for $7, laughed at on the courthouse steps for the spending of it. She understood now that she had, in fact, come home, to a town she had never once heard named before that week, to finish something her great-uncle had died trying to begin, and had died still hoping some scrap of his family might one day arrive to finish. She read the letter a third time before she finally blew out the lamp, and one line of it would not leave her. "I have wronged no one," Doyle had written, in that careful, failing hand, save perhaps in staying silent too long, and trusting that honest men would eventually be believed simply for being honest. "I have learned too late that the truth needs a keeper, same as any other treasure worth having." Naomi lay awake a long while in the small back room above the old bar, listening to the windwork at the loose shingles overhead, and found that she had, without quite deciding to, already appointed herself to the post. She moved carefully in the days that followed, aware that a widow with no standing in a town run by a banker like Cornelius Vance could not simply walk into the street waving a 22-year-old ledger and expect to be believed. She began instead by asking quiet questions of the aging storekeeper, Silas Whitcomb, whose grandfather's name she had found among the cooperative's earliest depositors, and of a sharp-eyed widow named Alma Reyes who took in mending and remembered from her own girlhood the year the miners' fund went bad, and the shamed, hollow-eyed man who had once owned the blind mule. It was Alma who pointed her toward Higgins Yardley, a stooped, sharp-minded old man who had served for decades as the town's notary and court recorder before his retirement, and who had never once, in 22 years, believed the official story of Elias Doyle's disgrace. "Man kept the straightest books I ever notarized," Yardley told her, squinting at the ledger she finally dared to show him. "Never did make sense to me that a man that careful would suddenly turn thief and botch the job so plain that everyone in town could see it. Always figured somebody wanted us looking at Doyle, so we wouldn't look too close at the bank." Word, inevitably, reached Cornelius Vance before Naomi was ready for it too. He came to the saloon himself on a gray afternoon, immaculate in a manner that seemed almost aggressive against the building's dust, his boots too polished for a street still thick with mud from the last rain, and offered her, with a smile that did not warm his eyes, $300 for a property she had bought for $7, a sum so wildly out of proportion to the building's worth that it told her, more plainly than any ledger could, exactly how frightened he was. He walked the length of the old bar as he spoke, one gloved hand trailing along the dovetailed edge Elias Doyle had cut a quarter-century before, and remarked, almost idly, that a woman in her position ought to think practically about her future rather than clinging to sentiment over a ruin. Naomi watched his fingers on the wood her gray uncle had shaped and said, as evenly as she could manage, that she had already thought a great deal about her future, and had decided it did not include selling. His smile thinned at that, and he reminded her, in a voice gone quiet and precise, that a woman alone in a town like Larkin's Notch depended a great deal on the goodwill of people like himself, on the lumber yard extending her credit, on the general store selling her flour, on the town council overlooking the many small ways an old, unsafe building might be condemned and cleared before winter. It was not quite a threat. It was worse in its way because it did not need to be. Within a fortnight, the lumber yard had suddenly run short of stock for her repairs. The general store's prices for a woman living alone in a cursed saloon had climbed unaccountably, and more than one neighbor who had greeted her kindly on the street now crossed to the far boardwalk instead, murmuring, when they thought she couldn't hear, that the widow up at the Blind Mule had taken to digging up old curses better left buried. Then a notice appeared, signed by the town council and pushed through with unusual haste, declaring the Blind Mule Saloon a public hazard slated for demolition within 10 days, before autumn frost could make the work harder. A deadline, Naomi understood at once, sized precisely to bury the truth a second time before she could ever bring it to light. Naomi understood, watching the notice go up, that Vance meant to bury the truth a second time, more thoroughly than the first, and that she had 10 days to stop him. She spent them working harder than she had ever worked in her life. Higgins Yardley, roused by an old anger he had carried for 2 decades in silence, dug through the courthouse archive until he found the original 1866 dissolution paper Vance had filed, brittle, yellowed, and, when laid beside a recent letter Vance had signed for the town council, unmistakably different in hand, the forged signatures confident loops nothing like the cramped, careful script Doyle's ledger showed as authentically his own. Silas Whitcomb and Alma Rays, once they understood what the ledger meant for their own grandparents' names, began quietly gathering others whose families had once trusted their savings to the cooperative, until Naomi found herself, on the ninth evening, sitting across a plain oak table from Judge Thaddeus Renner, the circuit judge who happened to be passing through on his regular rounds, laying out coin, ledger, letter, and forged paper together, and asking him, as steadily as her voice would allow, for one public hearing before a single board of that saloon came down. The hearing was held 2 days later in the town hall, ostensibly to discuss the condemned building's fate, and it was the fullest that hall had been in years. Every bench filled, latecomers standing 3 deep along the back wall, lamplight catching on faces Naomi had come to know over her short weeks in Larkin's Notch, and dozens more she had not. She had spent the previous evening arranging the ledger, the letter, the tarnished coins, and the 2 documents side by side on a plain table. The way her father had once arranged tools before a job he meant to get exactly right the first time. And she found, standing before that crowded room with her hands folded to keep them from shaking, that she was not nearly so frightened as she had expected to be. She thought of her mother's careful, sorrowful silence on the subject of her brother, and understood, finally, standing where Elias Doyle himself had once stood accused. That silence was precisely what had let the wrong stand uncorrected for 22 years. Naomi stood before the gathered town, farmers and shopkeepers, and the sons and daughters of men who had once handed their silver dust to a treasurer they trusted, and told them, plainly and without embellishment, what she had found beneath her floorboards, and who Elias Doyle had truly been. She laid the ledger open on the table where every claim holder's name could be read by anyone who cared to look, and set the forged dissolution paper beside a sample of Cornelius Vance's own current hand, and let Higgins Yardley, whose word in that town still carried the weight of 22 honest years, explain to the room exactly what the difference meant. She watched Vance's composure crack in slow, visible stages, watched the color drain from a face that had spent 2 decades practicing unbothered smiles, and she felt no triumph in it, only a long, quiet ache finally beginning to loosen in her chest. When Vance tried at the last to bluster that the ledger might be forged itself, it was Alma Rays who stood, uninvited, and said that her own grandfather's handwriting sat plain on page 11, recording his own deposit in his own hand, and she would know her grandfather's letters anywhere, curse or no curse. The room did not laugh at that. The room went very still. Judge Renner did not send Cornelius Vance to prison that night, nor in the weeks that followed, for the law in that place and time was not built to punish a wealthy man as harshly as it punished a poor one, and the theft, however monstrous, was 22 years old. But he ordered the bank's records opened for a full accounting, stripped Vance of his seat on the town council, and made plain, in a ruling read aloud to the whole hall, that the original cooperative's assets grown, with the silver's appraised value, and the accrued worth of the land Vance's bank had built its fortune upon, into a sum that made more than one person in that room weep openly, belonged rightfully to the descendants of the men and women who had first deposited them. Vance did not go to prison. He simply, over the following year, watched his standing dissolve exactly as Doyle's had once been made to dissolve, his bank's board replaced, his name spoken in Larkin's Notch from then on in the same careful, ashamed tone his own lies had once reserved for a dead saloon keeper. It was not the justice of a courtroom. It was the slower, older justice of a small town remembering, all at once, exactly who had told it the truth. Naomi was offered, as Elias Doyle's nearest living kin, the largest single share of what the accounting recovered, and she took only enough to clear her own way and to properly finish the work her great-uncle had died in the middle of. The rest she pressed, gently but immovably, back into the town's hands. A re-established cooperative fund, administered this time by a board of claim holders' descendants rather than any single banker, meant to carry the next hard winter the way the first fund had always been meant to. The Blind Mule Saloon itself, condemned no longer, she rebuilt board by board with her own two hands and her father's old chisel, and renamed it Doyle Hall, a plain, sturdy meeting house and assay office where the town's business could be done in daylight, in the open, where every ledger from then on would be kept the way her father had taught her a ledger should be kept, without a smudge, without an error, and without a single figure that could not stand up to daylight. She had a proper stone cut at last for the pauper's corner of the cemetery, one that gave Elias Doyle both his true name and the truth the old stone had never carried: treasurer, honest man, wronged and vindicated at last. We began this story with a woman of 45, cast out with $9 and no home, buying a cursed, worthless saloon for 7 of them because it was the only door left open to her. We hope you understand her differently now. Naomi Sutter had not, in truth, purchased a ruin. She had purchased the last unfinished piece of her own family's story, hidden for 22 years beneath a floor that only a carpenter's daughter would have thought to examine twice. Her father had told her, long before any of this began, that most people judge a thing by what has been done to it, rather than by what it is still capable of holding. And it was that single, quiet lesson, carried across half a continent in a trunk with a chisel and a Bible, that let her see past the dust and the rumor to the truth still sound beneath. She did not restore that fortune to keep it. She restored it to give it back to everyone it had always belonged to, and in doing so, she gave her great uncle back his name, and gave a dying town a reason to trust its own ledgers again. That, in the end, is the whole of what she found beneath the floorboards, not merely silver, but proof that what the world calls worthless is very often only waiting for someone patient enough to kneel down and look closer. Thank you for spending this evening with us, and with Naomi. If her story moved you, we would be glad if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that quiet, careful people so often turn out to be carrying more strength than the world ever gives them credit for. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off: a place, an old possession, or perhaps a person? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone, and we love hearing where these stories find you. Until next time, stay close.